Hello, sir.
How are you doing? How are we doing?
I'm doing well. It's good to be here with you. It's Monday afternoon. It's a little dreary, but when I think about chatting about deeper things with Ray Roberts, things have a little bit more of a spark to them.
Hopefully, I don't fail. I've been trying to stay on my game here.
Yeah,
Um, so I like the structure that we're doing now, where we kind of pick an overarching topic by the month, because what it enables me now to do is have the conversation at different levels. So maybe having the conversation with you here, it's like a an exhibition match. It's me and you sharing or having this recorded to be shared later. When we have our Saturday engagements with the men, that's
yeah.
kind of like the main event where no matter how much you plan, you never know where it's going to go. Um,
Hmm.
Everybody has a plan until they get in the ring. Um, but also, what it's allowed me to do is because of this structuring and this time allotment, where it's not just this one time thing, it's allowing me to kind of ingest it almost like a communion and make it a part of me
Mm.
where I'm finding myself not just having a conversation with you and not just having a conversation with my men's group, but I'm finding myself having this engagement through life, which is what it should be if it's about life application and spiritual application.
Yeah,
So this
that's
topic
good.
of ours of um, today we're going to be focusing on calling, but I see this little triumvirate we have of work, calling, and Sabbath. These topics I
Yeah,
have found are topics you can almost engage with anyone at any time.
yeah. And they are all related. They're actually, in some ways, they don't make sense apart from one another. So yeah, I like the way you're tying those things together because I think they hang together or they've got nothing to hang on. So yeah, that's good, right?
And I know we're going to get into it a little bit in deeper, but I think you use the term counterfeits. Your counterfeit callings or distorted callings,
Mm,
where when you're hanging them on things that either A are not real or they're not God, meaning it's something not strong enough, like hanging it on yourself. That's a conversation I'll want to share with you later. I had with a lady where she was hanging the calling on herself, and it was just wearing her. It was just wearing her through because your calling wasn't meant to literally sit on you. I argued.
yeah, yeah. Well, I think the idea of calling has a lot to do with meaning, and if you try and find your meaning entirely in yourself, I think you're just like you lose. You don't even get to leave the starting gate in a sense because everything that you've got in order to enjoy life is within the scope of your own body and your own energy and your own thoughts. And isn't the problem of meaning that your own thoughts aren't enough? Isn't the problem of a crisis of meaning that everything that you currently know is insufficient? Everything that you currently have experienced is still longing. It's like you haven't arrived, so you're still, at some level you're still open and you're still want. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. To be perpetually in want and ungrateful would be maybe a negative version of it. But to admit that, I'm actually not complete and there is more, and I still believe that there's more, and therefore I open up or I seek or I desire, all of that's an indication that no, you're not sufficient. And whatever meaning you define within the scope of your own limited insight is going to be insufficient. So it's sort of like almost tautological, right? It's by definition not enough to say that I am my own meaning.
I feel like maybe a good place to get into this is something that you shared with me the other day. Maybe to just get into the calling. Um, I believe the statement you said from a gentleman was, "There can't be a calling without a caller."
Oh yeah, yeah. So that's Oz. Isn't that Oz Guinness? I think that's
So I don't want to steal your thunder. I think that would be a good place to maybe just jump into this. It's
Yeah.
just
Let's do
it
it.
was impactful to me. Maybe we start there.
Yeah. Well, I think too, if we can bring to the fore the story of Moses.
Absolutely.
Moses, we talked about this in the men's groups, and I thought that, I mean, I just had not gone to some of the places that we ended up going together in the men's group last Saturday. So maybe between you and I, we can sort of revisit some of the key details of that famous moment in, I think was it Exodus 3, where Moses is, I'm guessing he's 80 years old, because I believe that when he was still in Egypt, he was 40. He had that terrible incident where he could see that his fellow Judeans were enslaved and being sort of oppressed and maltreated by their overseeing, I guess, slave driver, you could say. And he decided to intervene, and he ended up killing this guy. And as a result, he had to flee. He had to leave the city, leave the place where he'd grown up. He'd grown up in Pharaoh's house because his nurse, his mother had to put him out into the water because I guess Pharaoh had decided that he was going to kill all the firstborn children of Israel for whatever reason. I can't remember the details at the moment. So his mother sets him into this little wicker basket within the water and the reeds, and this woman of the palace ends up taking him into her home, and he gets raised in the palace like a son of the Pharaoh and a brother to the future Pharaoh. And so as a result, he's somebody who was raised in the aristocratic royal family of Egypt and can sort of see what's going on with his real people, which he finds out later from his actual mother, and who was, I believe, his nurse, right? Wasn't his mother who ended up being his nurse? So you're laughing. Am I making you think of something?
I had a little guest to our call, so that's why I was smiling.
Oh, okay, that's good. Well, we can bring him in or her in. So then, this is like he's into his adulthood, and I think he's starting to feel some measure of identification with his own people who are still enslaved, and he intervenes and kills this guy, and then he has to leave the city. But his people say to him, like, who made you in charge here? Like, why did you assume that you could take on this role of savior, I guess you could say? And so he's rejected by his people in a sense, and of course he's at risk of consequence with the royal family and the government. So he has to leave. And this is 40 years later where we start our part of the story today, which is related to the call of Moses. And it'll give us a way of talking about calling. And he's out walking about with this flock of sheep. He's taking care of his father-in-law's flock. He's been taken in by Jethro. He's now married. He has his own kids, and he's got a new home. He's got a new life. It's 40 years later. He's a good enough shepherd to have complete care of his father-in-law's flock. And he notices something out of his eye, periphery maybe. And it's this bush that's on fire, but it's not consumed. And he's like, what is that? He notices it, begins to wonder what it is. That's a strange thing. That bush, like it's on fire, but it's not burning up. So it's just flickering and flaming. And so he goes there to see what it is, and he realizes it's the Lord. And the Lord speaks to him out of the fire, and this is holy ground. Take off your sandals. This is holy ground. And then he approaches it, and then he has this conversation with God. God identifies himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, meaning Moses, your own great fathers, the fathers who actually really trusted in God and followed God, those guys, the ones who really knew how to live life, and therefore were well remembered. And I've heard the voice of my people crying out from under the hand of their oppressors, and I want to save them. I want to redeem them. And I'm calling you to do that. And Moses is, I think, taken aback. He's feeling insecure, perhaps, maybe haunted a little bit by his past, but he asks a few questions. How are they going to know that they should listen to me, and tell them that God sent me? Well, so what's your name? Like, can you give me your name? And he says, I am who I am. In different parts of scripture, it kind of is the God who was and is to come. But there's this connotation of being in it. And it's kind of an awesome thing that he's being told. And so then he has the name, and he's told to call the elders of Israel so that they would be gathered with him and then released from Egypt so that they could go out and worship. And ultimately, it's so that they could come into the promised land. It's for that purpose of worship and for the purpose of the promised land, that he's asking Moses to do this. And so this is his calling, and there's a lot of different features that come out of that I thought we could use, just explore some of the different elements. I gave you just a really quick highlight on it. Did I miss something that you recall about?
Pretty solid, actually. I wanted to jump right into it. You covered it pretty well. So one part you said maybe he was haunted by his past, but I have it up here in front of me, Exodus 3, and Moses' response, 3:11. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? I think that's absolute proof he was haunted, because what was said to him when he killed that Egyptian?
Yeah.
The question that was given to him was, who are you?
Who do you think you are?
So for him to then say, well, who am I? I feel that connects.
Yeah.
This
is a great place to start, isn't it? Because we were, in fact, thinking that really calling is about identity. It has a lot to do with our identity and the question, who are we? And who do we think we are? Sometimes people actually say that to us. Like, you're expressing an opinion. Why do you get to express an opinion? You're trying to insert yourself. Why do you think you can do that?
It's not that often that the world challenges our work or our stated cause. They usually challenge us of being the person to engage it. If you think about how the world moves.
Yeah.
It wasn't even, so let's rewind it again. So when he killed the Egyptian, his people weren't bothered of the act itself. It was, who are you to do it? I can put myself in that position. Things were not going great. So they're kind of like, let's just keep our heads down. Let's not cause any trouble. And here this guy, whoever he is, causes trouble. And I could see the people saying, you don't think we wanted to do that too? You know what I mean? You don't think that we thought about doing that? Who are you to be the one to make that move? Now we have to deal with the consequences.
Yeah.
And so I'm seeing here that same setup where if the world challenges who you are, that shame part.
Yeah.
If your foundation yourself is shaken, it almost doesn't matter what cause or what calling comes your way, because you're not set. You're not right. There, a cause or a calling, and I think I see this in people. A cause or a calling is not going to fix you.
Yeah.
So
I think
get fixed here. Him.
Yeah, yeah. So cause or calling is not going to fix you. There's something about his calling that he, at some level, he must understand, even when he's back in Egypt. But the way that it gets expressed is, it's probably just really immature. It's certainly not recognized by his own people. I think that even real, authentic callings, where you have a special gift or maybe even an expertise. You think about expertise and experience. Moses had good experience and expertise of a sort. He was from the palace. He kind of knew how things worked. And he was also part of the people that were being oppressed. So he lived in both worlds. In some ways, he is the ideal person to relate up and help those who are down to be given a hand up. He was in a good position, and he has some kernels of awareness that are accurate, but he hadn't earned the right. He hadn't earned the trust. His timing was off, and certainly his action was precipitous and, in that case, violent. 2 times in Moses' life where you see his major character defect is to act in a moment of, I guess you could say, aggression, right? And that's when those are the 2 times that he really very close to who he is, but actually violates the integrity of who he is. And this is the challenging thing about calling, is that we can often get very close to real calling and still violate our integrity and still not be truly who we are. So when he kills the Egyptian, it's a burst of anger. He's very immature at that stage. And I think Os Guinness says that was a mistake. That you could look at that almost like a mistake, because he was operating a little bit of ignorance, so to speak. But later on, it was clear that he should have known better when he struck the rock, when God said, all I want you to do actually is speak, and I will bring water from the rock. And as a result of that, intemperance, that aggression unleashed and untempered, he himself doesn't get to go into the fullness of the promised land. So I think there's something about calling itself that has to do with, to a certain extent, learning to self-govern. You're discovering who you are, you're discerning who you are, and then you have to also govern yourself so that you can carry out your calling in a way that's true, in a way that people will recognize and be able to respect. Give them a reason to respect you, because you understand enough of yourself and the situation and how you fit in, that you can be trustworthy. So that's the concept of this one aspect of I think counterfeit. But maybe let's see. What the other is, there's a few other things, like right at the beginning of the story, as we see Moses trying to get who he really is, and how this experience of calling from God starts to make that really shine. I was thinking there's just a couple elements of the story right at the very beginning of when he sees the bush that I think are worth calling attention to. So what?
Opening there, now Moses was tending the flock to Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian.
Yeah.
And he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called him from within the bush, Moses.
Okay, let's stop right there. Yeah, and he's using his name, Moses, from within the bush. Just a few things that I think are interesting. So he is watching the flock, but he's on the mount of the Lord, the holy mountain of the Lord. And I think that's significant. Whenever you see that throughout the Old Testament in particular, and you see Jesus allude to it in the New Testament, the mountains were the places of worship. And they sort of symbolize something significant about who we are as human beings and how we occupy this middle space where we're on the earth, we're connected. In fact, we are made of earth. We're humus. It's the same root. Humus is the same root as human, and it just means we're soil creatures, you could say. Sometimes we're really aware that we're soil. But here it is. It's a mountain, and it's called the mountain of the Lord, and it's a place of worship as a result of its kind of mediating place. It's a place that sort of moves up from the ground and yet also can touch the heavens. In fact, you can even see clouds sometimes descend on a mountain. So it's like, even though you're standing on ground, you're still in the heavens all at once. And so there's there's an interest. So, the psalmist talks about going to the mountains and whence our help comes. It comes from the Lord, but it's this place that, where we actually meet God while we are ourselves soil. And so there's something that's indicated in that I think if you look at it, that's the first bookend of the story, because you see where it's going to end is he's going to be told by God, I want you to bring my people out of oppression back to worship, back to this place of rest with me and conversation with me. And it's kind of, in a way, he's saying, like, I want to bring people back to that conversation that Adam and I used to have every evening in the garden. Yeah, this is what I want for my people. That's what he wants for us. So there's something about the beginning there on the mountain that I think is worth saying. Like, if we think about calling as something that has to come from something greater than us, where do we go to seek the greater that becomes the source of the meaning?
So what are these mountains for guys today?
Yeah.
What are their mountains?
Yeah. I think those are places where something really strikes you. Something has profoundly impacted you. Sometimes there's remarkable experiences that we have that affect us for our whole lives. And you might even say, like Moses, let me just give one example that then we could maybe compare to our own lives. Moses, it says he's called Moses because he's drawn out of the water. So there's the literal meaning of his name has to do with being drawn out of the water. And then, well, what does he do with Israel? He actually draws them through the water too. So he's got this remarkable experience very early on that becomes informative of a meaning that he realizes is bigger than him. And God is kind of speaking to him in a way that obviously is bigger than our limited experience. He's speaking in a bush that's on fire, but it's not consumed. And you realize it's in an earthly reality, but something heavenly is happening, because fire should burn it up. That's not normal. And I think the nature of calling, when it's real, it'll have these shimmering moments to it where you realize, oh, I was touching in on something that's so deep or so profound that it lights me on fire. And I do think there's something about the fire even that speaks to that. Fire is associated with the holiness of God. It's a refining fire sometimes. But the things that last after fire are the things that are most real in life. Right? So we talk about metal and being fire tested, metal that's purified in fire. Has our metal been tested? And I think what I'm saying with all of this, the mountain, the fire, and these shimmering moments in Moses' life, is that I think there are things that we can discern in our own lives where we did have a sense like, oh, you know what? I think I got a hint of something really critical. And for me, it was very early on. I used to say, I think I want to go into the ministry. And I didn't even know what that meant. But I remember the first time I brought it up, it was two old ladies in the church. And I said, I think I want to go to ministry. I think I want to be a theologian. I had no idea what the word meant. It's a big word. I was like maybe 9 years old or something like that. And they said, oh boy, you want to be a theologian, huh? And later on, I found out that really one of the ancient definitions of that is just somebody who prays truly and somebody who truly prays. And but that conversation with these two old ladies became so significant to me, because the thing I remembered about these two old ladies were that they prayed a ton. And I had no idea that one of the oldest definitions of theologian at that point was that somebody who prays truly and somebody who truly prays. And so that, for me, became an example of, like, there was something happening there that was so meaningful, that became kind of a light for me. And it burned in me even. It was like that flame inside, And I think it has a guidance quality to it as a result. It was an encounter with God. I didn't even fully realize that it was God. It just stood out, It was like Moses noticing the bush.
So we see that Moses sees the bush. So he sees this strange sight. So he's like, okay, that's different. Now I think about all the possible things a man could have done. He could have said, that's different, and I'm scared, and ran away. Instead, think about his job. Let's just say exciting things didn't happen every day. So he's tending the flock. He breaks through the wilderness to the mountain, and there on the mountain, he sees something you don't see every day. You would think that someone with such a meek lifestyle would probably cut, chase, and run. But instead, he goes, "You don't see that every day. Let me go closer." So I'm wondering if there's maybe a message in that statement there of when you see something you don't see every day
Mm.
that is not being consumed, do you allow it to consume you? Do you allow it to take your attention?
Hmm.
I think there's a lot of things happening right now today where people are saying that is consuming me, so I'm going to flee. That is too much. That is too big. I don't want to get involved. Whether it's feeding the homeless or anything you can think of, it's too much. I'm going to flee it.
You
There's
may,
consuming things that don't get consumed. They don't go away.
yeah, that's right. So that goes back to the pressure testing. Like what really stands up after pressure testing is that which is truly firm and undeniable. And what's really revealed in a fire is the most pure elements. And so there is something about the real thing in your life. It will insist upon you attending to it. Like if you really have a particular calling in life, it's not going to go away. That was what my one of my earliest pastors said to me was, if you really have a calling, it's probably like the thing that you should do last. Like if you can't help but do it, you try everything else, and then if everything else really you've tried it and it's just not sticking, and you keep coming back to this, then that's a real thing because it's you, and it's not being burnt up by the fires of life. It's not burning you out. In other words, it's the flame that gives you energy. It doesn't kill it, right?
I always want to say it doesn't consume you because it is you. So how some
Yeah.
people are looking for their calling to fix them, I'm wondering if your calling is you to some degree, to where it can't harm you because it is you.
Yeah.
Fire harm fire. Okay.
Yeah.
So this idea of if it's so, well, maybe that's another way to say it. Your cause is consuming, but it doesn't consume you. But that same exact cause could burn up another person.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. I think that's true. I don't know why it didn't burn up the bush, but it's showing that there's something about real life. And of course, he's revealing himself as the source of all life being, right? But the real being of Moses is being revealed, and the real being at the center of all being is revealing himself. And so, yeah, I think there's something about calling that is revelatory of ourselves. God's revealing himself to us when he gives us our calling, and it's in meeting him that this happens. By the way, that maybe is one of the first things to notice about calling too. We're talking so much about identity, real calling, that's therefore actually meaningful, and its reality gets tested by this encounter that's shockingly amazing, but it stands up to the pressure testing because it's real. But it's also just so striking, if you think about it, that this is a personal encounter, and it's a relational moment. Calling itself implies a caller, as we said. So we're back to where you said that's a good place to start, because it really is. The whole concept of calling, even vocation just being, voice, we get the same word as voice is in vocation, except in the Latin, it's vox, right? It's vocation. It implies caller, and he's calling to you.
I think I want to try a different metaphor for our listeners here. I want to envision a tuning fork. So you have a caller and the call, where that tuning fork doesn't get a response from every string in the piano. It only gets a response from a specific string. So this idea of one, that call is not for everyone, first off. And then two, the reason why the specific person who answers the call answers it is because of their identity, something about them specifically.
That is so good. I really love that, right? Because I think it is kind of like it is like a tuning fork, that responds to a particular, I don't know, what is it called? The vibrate
Hertz frequency.
Hertz
Yeah.
frequency, yeah. And I think there's something about, well, even the word person means literally to sound through, right? So God's sounding out Moses. He's calling to him, he's sounding him out. He's drawing him close, he's evoking him back into relationship with him, with God. So he's going to engage him in a conversation, a dialogue, and that starts to resonate in such a way that he becomes, once again, a person. He becomes truly his own person, who has a conversation with God. That's amazing. That's a really good metaphor. And the fact that there's light involved is also maybe helpful, because I do feel like it's one of the other things you remember about Moses is he would regularly go in and have these conversations with God in the tent, from which this pillar of fire that led Israel by night and a cloud by day. He'd go into the tent and he'd be in the presence of God in that fiery place. And at one point, he was so in the presence of God that he came out and his face was shining, and that he was lighting up with the truth of who he was, having been sort of encountered by God and commissioned by God so that he could bring words to them. And he did bring words. They're called the 10 Commands. So there's something about the way God's sounding him out and the way God's enlightening him that makes Moses become so alive with who he is in light of God and what he is to say with his life in light of the words God speaks to him, that he is finally truly called, and he's a person of God. So to me, that those are like a lot of incredible metaphors for calling and what it feels like. I think we all have an instinctive sense of it, that it's bigger than us. And if you believe in God, you immediately have an awareness that the transcendent dimension that we long for is very personal. Of course, that's the story here. It's a personal engagement of a real dialogue and a real conversation that actually is addressed to Moses. He's called by his name twice. And Moses, by the way, the reason you call somebody is because they're further away. Moses, there's something that is reaching Moses where he's at in order to draw him closer to where he needs to be. And so Moses has to respond. And so maybe that's the second thing to notice, is that it's not just relational, but it's actually an engagement that requires a response. And you need to move. You need to let yourself be moved and motivated to move. And then you have to go. You first come to God, and that's the first thing, is you have to be moved enough to come to God. So he goes to the mountain, sees the fire, he notices the fire starts to draw closer. Then he begins to hear God, and then he draws even closer. And there's movement all throughout all of that. And he's moving truer and truer to the center of what he needs to hear.
I kind of find a little humor in this exchange as well, because I got the little kids now, and so I will call the toddler. He knows his name, but he will still look at me like, me? As if it's possible there was someone else I was talking to. I'm smiling because God was very clear and said Moses' name twice. But Moses still, who am I? Are you sure you got the right guy? So I find like a very parent-child moment in this of, I want you to do, are you sure you're talking to me? Did you say me when you know full well you are the one being referenced?
Yeah. There's I mean, you see that kind of throughout with the conversation with Moses. You can hardly believe it. I mean, it's amazing. Of course, it'd be amazing to anybody to have that experience, but wait a minute, seriously? Wait, who is this? What is this? What's going on? You're talking to me? Man.
But in asking, he knows the answer, because for the answer to change, then God would not be God. if God had said, "Oh, sorry, my mistake,"
Yeah,
thought you were different Moses.
yeah. He the other thing I notice about that, like, so it's maybe is a little bit of disbelief and sheepishness because of his past, but there's got to be a hope, right? Because he's drawing near, not like because he's horrified, right? He's not like transfixed like a deer in the headlights. He still has his wits about him. Like he still has enough sobriety to make a choice to move towards it, not because he's transfixed, but because he's maybe enchanted. Um, it's something that draws him. It's beautiful, perhaps. The scriptures talk about the beauty of holiness, and so maybe that's worth saying too. Is that what's moving him to draw nearer to the place of the center that he needs to hear the calling from, so he can be truly centered as who he is, and then from that center go forth into the world, bringing what he really has to bring. He's got to have hope. He's got to he's got to see that that possibility is even possible, and there's a good intent behind it. And so there's something even about that that's faithful. I guess, you have to trust and hope if you're going to come into true calling. Cynics, I don't think, become called, or they don't realize their calling.
Well, I'm gonna go back to the tuning metaphor because I watched the piano tuner tune my piano recently. And so I guess the way the tuning forks work, there's a specific tuning fork for a specific string, but because the strings kind of repeat the harmonic scale, so maybe the specific tuning fork is meant for this string, but it kind of halfway or a third or a fifth of the way frequency ignite, it makes another string react, not to the same level, not to the same volume. So what the piano tuner was doing, she was putting a towel over the string she was not looking for. So what I'm wondering here, when you have been shamed, when you are unsure of who you are, and then the world tries to hit our tuning fork, is there sometimes a requirement for us to remove that towel so we can resonate properly? Because we're still resonating because it's definitely ours, but we can't resonate to our fullness because we've covered ourselves. Again, he left. It was 40 years. I mean, he didn't change his name or anything, but he was kind of playing it a little low. And even his response about going back, I think it's safe to get the impression that if Moses had it his way, he wouldn't have gone back.
That's really good, because maybe there is a way in which to really resonate with the truth of who he is, he had to be stripped of, he had to, like, all the other things that were kind of resonating but not really supposed to, those other strings in his life, I guess you could say, that weren't really meant to be played, at least not then. They had to be quieted, maybe. We do see that, like, 40 years, again, that's another, I often want to bring out aspects of that you see recur in scripture, because usually that means that there's a symbol there. It's speaking to a larger reality that repeats itself throughout scripture. So you see Moses 40 years. You see the 40 years of Israel in the desert that almost imitates that. Why did that happen? It happened for Israel because they failed to go into the promised land when they were supposed to. They didn't fully trust. And that meant that not all the strings were resonating when they should have. They were late to the game. He was maybe ahead of the game in his life, but 40 years ended up being a season for Israel of being stripped of those other strings, of having all of that quieted. And with Moses, he did have to go into a season, I guess you could say, of quieting down all of those urges that just would flame into fire, that actually did consume, that actually did burn and hurt him and others. And so he's been doing it very quietly, so much so that he became the meekest man on earth, the humblest man on earth. He was truly human then. I think there's something about being fully human that knows you're not all that, that knows you shouldn't just assume and you know be lording it over other people and asserting yourself aggressively without having one trust. There's something very human that had to come into play. And then that also is the place that realizes I'm not God, but I need him. And maybe that's what makes him aware. Maybe that's what makes it possible for him to see God and to notice it. You said the other day to me, he who's faithful in little is faithful in much. And if he's going to be a shepherd of Israel, which is often how God describes himself and then all of the leaders that he sets over Israel, then you have to learn how to be a good shepherd of your own heart and a good shepherd of your own home. If you're going to be a good shepherd of a nation, like a steward of my nation, then you need to be humble and you need to be able to pay attention and take care of sheep because they're vulnerable and there's all kinds of threats. And you have to be alert to those threats and any change in the environment that might represent threat. And so maybe there's something, he's become very humble. He cares for these sheep because he cares for his family. And in that place of real responsibility, at that level, comes the possibility of being called to a higher level that even more completes his calling and fulfills it, if that makes sense.
Your words, maybe pull up something here.
There's a great quote I want to read to you because this is not only a Christian and Hebrew thing, right? It's like, because you see this, what I just said, like, if you're faithful in little, you're faithful in much, quoting Jesus. But the idea, that was how Christian leaders were discerned and how anything really is discerned, is you start with small and you go big. But there's this great quote from Confucius that, and he's speaking about this idea going from small to big and these sort of Russian doll realities that get expanded outward, Russian dolls that they're nested within themselves, if you know what I'm talking about. But anyway, he says, if there's harmony in the heart, there will be harmony in the family. If there's harmony in the family, there will be harmony in the nation. If there's harmony in the nation, there will be harmony in the world. And what we see is that, the ecosystems are all interdependent. They're all nested one within the other. And, that's why it's so important for leaders to listen to those who follow them so that the larger ecosystem in which the followers are contained is not disrupted by the greater ecosystem of the government, And so you see that, like, this harmony that has to be spread throughout. And Moses, he did have an eventual call to be a leader, and but he just wasn't ready for it, or at least, and the people weren't ready for him. And there had to be a place of humbling for him that he had to go through. In his case, he needed to learn how to listen to the people, Real leaders listen to people. Real leaders actually so take care of their flock that they're able to notice the one who is on the margins, who gets attacked, the one who's on the margins that falls into the pit, and then you go get him. That's what a real leader does. And I don't think Moses could have done that at that point.
So I pulled this up here. This is 1 Corinthians 7:17. Nevertheless, each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned to them, just as God has called them. This is the rule I lay down in all churches. So when I read that in context of Moses, there was the calling, you're being called, ring, ring, but then there is the assignment. And when I read that there, you live as a believer and basically not questioning your assignment.
Yeah.
That is your testament. That is your gospel. Your vocation is your gospel. It is your ministry of competence as a faith walker to carry out your assignment in faith. You
Mm-hmm.
don't say, you sure? Is there something else I can do?
Yeah. That's really good. He did, I guess he got an assignment, didn't he? He got an assignment to take care of his family, and he did all of it in a humble enough and a loving and careful, caring way enough that actually opened up his heart to be able to even begin to perceive a God who might call him and might actually address him and call him to response and be responsive. And therefore, that's an interesting thing too. It's like he's responsive to his wife, he's responsive to his father-in-law, he's responsive to the sheep, he's responsive to the environment. All of that responsiveness makes him responsible. And then what does God do? He calls him, and now Moses has refined his responsiveness skills enough to become responsible to God and to become responsible for not just his family, but an entire people, you know?
Oh, someone's actually watching us here. Nice stream. Keep it up. So we got some people following us on Twitch here. Okay. Thank you, sir. And this is my very close buddy Eric Olson as well here with me today, just so everyone knows. So I don't know when you came up. Actually, yeah, I do see when you came up a couple minutes ago. But yeah, we're just kind of just a quick recap, big picture, everyone. The overall idea is brotherhood, connection, relationship. What are we here for? What is the purpose? What is the way to get through? Because I think big picture, we can all just start here and say, we're just trying to get through. So I know some of you may be hearing us speak and you're like, I'm not a Christian, or I'm not all about this church stuff. But I say, let's focus on what we have in common. I believe that we probably all have in common, we're just trying to get by, Well, we're not really no one's really looking for trouble. Everyone's trying to get through, maybe have a couple dances before you die, maybe a couple laughs, some good food. But also what we're digging in this month here is your work and your calling and Sabbath, all cover these things with self-care. So what you're hearing us talking about right now through Moses, it's not to try to bore you with an old story that has nothing to do with your life. We're arguing here, if you're listening to us, quite the opposite. We're saying there's a lot you can pull from this story. And if you look at your life in real time, what are those burning bushes that you're not paying attention to or you ran from? What is that moment where you weren't resonating to your calling because you weren't ready or you didn't believe in yourself? As we're getting into it now, we're kind of digging deeper here. We're kind of needling a little bit, if you want, the calling versus the assignment. So that's what you're hearing us talk about now. So yeah. Any questions, anything you want us to go back on, definitely let us know. And we're just here having this conversation, covering, even though I said the three things of work, calling, and Sabbath. We did a previous stream, which you can find, talking about work, where we stated our nexus around work. But today, while these items are not separable, so you can't just box them separately. But today, our main scoping is the idea of calling. Calling, who calls, what is a calling? How do you know a calling's real? One way I always think about it is, I heard someone say that make sure it's Jesus calling you out of the boat to walk on the water before you jump out there. So that idea of who is calling you, and are you really being called? How do you tune yourself to be more open to what the world and what is being sent to you, what is being communicated to you about you and your place in this world?
Yeah, so Moses is rediscovering God and then himself. And the reason he's able to is because he's been responsive. He's been responsive to the voices of those that depend upon him, his wife, his father-in-law, even the sheep that he's caring for. And that responsiveness training has made him responsible. And then, therefore, I think that's what sets him up to be responsive to a burning bush that's odd, to even notice it, and then to be respondent to the one who's calling him so that he can have that calling. And it's a conversation, and it happens throughout his life. And really, his purpose in many ways is to bring everybody into a conversation with God themselves, his entire nation, all 12 tribes and all people. And in the long run, their assignment was, as Israel, was to make it possible for all the nations to have a conversation with God. So I think in some ways what we're saying is a real calling here is something that is always relational. It's always a conversation that's ongoing. It's responsive, and it's connected. It's a connecting connection that you want to spread and share. It doesn't matter what your calling is. You're an artist, you're a leader, I don't care what it is. If you're really genuinely acting out of a calling, you're connected. You're connected to yourself and the unique giftedness you have to share, and you're helping others also connect to that, which I think comes from God. But it could also be that you encounter it through real connections with the transcendence of the beauty of nature, for instance. A lot of great artists do that.
And I think this will probably be one of my last contributions to the conversation here, but how you're focusing on, he was taking care of his flock. He was taking care of, well, not his flock, I'm sorry, his father-in-law's flock, actually. So he was taking care of his family. He was being what he needed to be in the family. But God basically came to him and said, yes, I see everything you're doing, and that's why you are prepared to continue to your full calling. And it brings me to again, I think this will be my last scripture for this session here. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart. Colossians 3:23. So reading that 3:23 Colossians in context of this story, I am seeing that, yes, Moses was doing the right things, but he wasn't vibrating at his full frequency.
Yeah.
So it wasn't all of his heart. It wasn't all what his heart was capable of. Again, to our point, 40 years is a long time, but when we bury things in the past, that's a very human mentality to say some things are better left lay buried. That mentality is not, I argue. So anyone, you don't have to wholly trust me, but this is my opinion. I argue that such a voicing, it is not from scripture. It is not guidance that we're given to say some things are better left lay buried. Now, don't misconstrue me. I'm not saying we sit around and we rue and we regret. That's not what my statement is about. It's more about, maybe you had a wound and you wrapped it up really tight, but you didn't wrap it properly. And yes, it will hurt like heck unwrapping it. And it might be a lot of pain having to deal with the improper treatment in the beginning. So it's even possible that, dealing with the improper treatment might hurt more than the original wound. That's quite possible. But it doesn't change the fact that it's the right thing to do. Never dislocated anything. No, that's not true. I did dislocate a shoulder once. You don't want it put back in. Now, if you've had it happen more than once, then you do, but you don't want anyone touching you. There's a part of you that's just saying, leave it. I'll just walk around like this the rest of my life. Leave me alone.
Yeah.
But there's also a part of you that knows that's not truth.
Right.
That's not truth. You can't stay here in this situation. Never broken any bones, but I imagine it might be the same, where you probably don't want that broken leg set, but it needs to be set.
You're saying, like, healing to become whole sometimes involves a healing pain. but it's also like growing. Sometimes in order to grow involves a growing pain. And to be stretched into something that you've never been stretched into before is, yeah, I mean, I guess there's maybe fear, maybe pain involved, but we see that in Moses. He had to go through, had to go through in order to become himself. And I think even the pain that he went through is probably, at least the way God works, and this is why I think to understand this in a relationship to God is so helpful. The way God works is he takes those things that actually really are tragic or even evil in life, and he's so creative that he can make use of those. He can actually make use of those in such a way that it prepares you to help others and to be a light to others when they're in darkness. Moses had to go through 40 years in the wilderness. That enabled him to help lead Israel in their 40 years through the wilderness. He had to deal with his own, what do you call it? Like confrontation. Like, how do you deal with confrontation? He didn't deal with it well. He became violent initially. And then he's gonna face really intense opposition from Pharaoh. So part of his experience in the long run of really trusting in God instead of his own retaliatory strength is the means by which God then rescues Israel. All of that training, even the pain.
And he wasn't a young man, as we said. He was in his 80s. So again, wanting to not deal with it today, he wasn't getting younger. Let's just say that. So again, the pain of facing that wasn't going to get easier with time. It was only going to get harder.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think maybe we could call out a couple more things from Moses that I think are related to calling. And we started with this idea that it has to be bigger than you, that the transcendent part, bigger than where you are, bigger than who you are. So it's a stretching reality that also is humbling because you're not there yet. So you have to look beyond yourself. I think this is what we used to understand. You'd get a mentor, right? I think a lot of times these days what we do is we say, well, I'm already arrived, and if you don't recognize my greatness, then I'm going to change the rules. I think it's Os Guinness uses the example of some of the so-called schools of art these days have said, well, I can't really abide by the rules of Impressionism, so I'm going to create my own form of art, which is just an excuse not to have to discipline yourself. And I think that's a little bit of a pot shot, a little bit of a simplistic critique, but I think there's something to that there is a season where in order to really become there's these twin virtues. It's humility and magnanimity. You and I have talked about this before, right? Like,
yes.
Your greatness is not supposed to be held back from the world. But your greatness is not just about you. It's a reflection of something you've been given. And that's why it's the flip side of humility. Now you may have received a gift, like you learned tennis from your dad, who was a superstar, but then you become a champion. So you've refined it even further, but you also know very much you received it as a gift. So it's this combination of humility that is the only means by which you come into true greatness. And your glory, as Paul says, goes from one stage of glory to another by virtue of that grace. It's a gift. And then you're involved with it. You're not passive. You're involved with it. You're responsible to it. But it's an ongoing interdependency is maybe another way to say what I'm saying. So,
I think when we talked about this before, we went about talking about water, how water, quote unquote, is yours. But if you don't allow that water to move and cycle, it no longer becomes about life. It becomes about death. Stagnant water is a place of death.
That's good.
Moving water is where you think about life. So if you truly want the true blessing of water, you allow it to flow and move and evaporate and fall back down from the mountains and then keep moving through. If you try to dam up the river, you will create death. So I think what you're saying here with your gifts and the things you received and the things you've inherited, if you keep them to yourselves, they're just like that stagnant water. They will die.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. So he's willing to be very humble and receiving it as a gift, but exercising it for others. And he starts with his family, and it extends eventually to his nation because of that humility. And so the idea of Moses being the meekest man on the earth, the humblest man on the earth, who talked face to face with God. And that's meant to be like an incredible paradox, a contrast. Like you wouldn't think that. You should already be like Pharaoh. Like Pharaoh was, they called him God, right? And they called him the sun god, I think. And Moses is like, that's not the real God. The real God you encounter through humility. And of course, the experience of, bringing the oppressed ones out of Egypt sort of demonstrates that the real God is encountered through humility, right? Because eventually the greatness of the real God, of the God of the Hebrews, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is stronger than the strongest civilization on the face of the planet at that point. So there's something about humility within the Judeo-Christian understanding that we bring to the table, and our weakness, and God manifests his strength. And so that's why Paul can say, I'm grateful for my weakness, because now when things happen, when I bring my weakness to the table, my humility, my dependence upon him, then he comes through. And boy, does he come through.
Well, I think of C.S. Lewis when he said, humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking about yourself less.
Yeah.
So you can be aware of your greatness. You're not expected to downplay your gifts and your talents. You're just not expected to sit there looking in the mirror, admiring your gifts and talents, not using them because you're staring in the mirror. Again, you're stagnant. You're in stasis.
Yeah. And you're revolving around yourself when you do it that way, I think. Your gifts and talents they are for others. They're there to, and I think for Moses, the whole context for him was he was leading people out so that they could worship God, so they could come into the same encounter that he had. That was the whole purpose. And that ultimately they come into their promised land where God cares for them. It's a land of milk and honey where he just provides for them. But it was always about bringing people into that which was greater than themselves and making them able to share in the things that he had already shared in. And I think that's a real calling, has to be about more than just yourself. So I wonder if that's an important thing to say, because I think if beginning and end, it's about worship. Now, I want to define that word, because I think a lot of times we hear worship in these days, and we don't. I mean, maybe it's, is it just that stuff that happens in Sunday for Christians, right? Or is that, or whatever religion, like people bowing like that. And I think it has something that reveals something about worship. But the idea of worship is you're before something that's really worthy. It's weighty, and that's the meaning of it. It's so weighty that you can't help but honor it for its weight. I mean, it's like you're a scale, and that weight is heavy. And so there's a way in which, if you relate to somebody in the truth of who they are, the weight of who they are is something you let impress itself upon you, and then you honor them. You treat them in a manner that's worthy of them. And I think what I'm saying here is that even if you're not a Christian, what you really ultimately want to be able to do with your life is to share with other people that which is worthy. What is really worthy of your lifelong devotion, and what is really so worthy of that kind of giving of your life that you want to share it with others. And I think that's what Moses is doing here. He starts at this place of incredible beauty and revelation. And his whole point then, from that point forward, is to share that with the people he cares about and make them a nation of people that are supposed to share it with all known 70 nations in the world at that point. Does that make sense? Like this idea?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was thinking about that the Timothy Keller quote, where he says, "Everyone needs to work out in clear personal terms how their work serves the world." I think what you're saying is you need something outside of yourself to work for.
Yeah.
Because working just for yourself is pointless. I mean, think about it. You're not pointing anywhere. You are not pointing anywhere. Pointing at yourself really doesn't make much sense in the context of this conversation. So, if you are here to serve you, it does beg the question: what's the point of you?
Yeah, and if your point is inward, it's a terminal point. It's a mortal point. It's going to not last, and that's just not enough. And that's where this idea of what is really worthy and what is really lasting, what is going to last through the fires of testing. And I think it's the eternal. And you could say
think about a tool or an object that you ask somebody, what does that do? Oh, it takes care of itself.
Yeah.
You're just like, okay, so it's useless. That's what you would say. It's useless.
Yeah, because it's not
doesn't do anything.
It's not related to anything else. So and the ultimately most worthy things in life are related to everybody. They're most relatable. I think God is the most relatable ultimately, because he transcends it all, and from him all of it emerges. So Moses is showing us, I think, something very, very deep about what it means to be a person, what it means to have an identity, what it means to have a calling, and it has to be bigger than you. And one of my favorite writers talks about, well, what does it mean to be a human being? And we often say, well, human being is what Homo sapiens, right? It's a creature of wisdom. And it's because I suppose we think that our species is the most intelligent on the planet. Sometimes it doesn't behave that way. But Homo sapiens, but this guy that I'm thinking of, he would say, well, actually, I think that what's unique about human beings is that we are supposed to be Homo adorans, like we are creatures that adore that which is greater, and we continue to bring everything in our awareness, in our lives, up into that greater beauty, that greater truth, that greater goodness. We're made to come into that and draw others into that. And I think that's right. Of course, you need wisdom to do that. You need to have wisdom to know that you aren't that, and have the wisdom to know that you need to pay attention when that shows up, like in a burning bush. But the real thing is that what do you love enough and desire enough and long for enough and discipline yourself to enough that you want to share it, that it's enough for you to continue to enjoy, but it's also so wonderful you want to bring others into it, which again goes back to, like, Moses starts there and then he ends there with this idea of himself in worship and bringing others into worship. What is that worthiness? And I think you become human when you finally come to grips with that. There's this, how we often quote Descartes, I think, therefore I am. I think that's consistent with the idea of Homo sapiens. But there's another person, I forget his name, he says, amo, ergo sum. I love, therefore I am. And I think that in some way the artist and the person with a call realizes that. They've got that flame has now come into their own heart. And it's a flame that motivates them, doesn't consume them, but it motivates them. And it's something that's, it longs for God, but it's also pouring itself out, in generosity. Does that make sense? I mean, I'm speaking like a metaphorical way there.
I'm tying in here because what I'm hearing is, so how we're talking about, imagine we talked about imagining the object that, so you ask what it does and someone says it just takes care of itself. Like, well, that's useless. Well, after the period of time for man of alchemy, trying to make gold out of things that were more readily available, silver and gold and stuff, there was a period of time in man's history of trying to make perpetual machines.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah.
There was this was a very it was a pretty good span of time. I want to say even into the early 1900s, there were people attempting to make perpetual machines. I think even to this day, they have like fun little kids, science kits where kids try to make these things. So I'm trying to connect this idea. First off, you can't build a perpetual machine, but maybe coming back to design, grander design, you can't build a perpetual machine because if you could, you would have something that serves no purpose other than serving itself.
Yeah, it's not pouring out anything.
Right.
It's not taking in anything. Yeah.
Because if it's not pouring out or taking in and it can keep going, that's why we don't have perpetual machines. They give off entropy. They give off energy. They give off heat. They give off light, magnetism, whatever it is. So entropy is the reasoning why we can't do perpetual machines. But if you could, you would in fact have something that gives nothing and takes nothing and loses nothing. I believe talking this way, that's an abomination.
Yeah.
That's I think we were talking about the acedia. Love nothing, hate nothing, think for nothing, want for nothing. I think we were speaking about that the other day where such a person, such a perpetual machine, it's a sin. So I'm seeing a lot of connections to conversations we have, whether it's people or science. That was Miss Dorothy Sayers. We were talking about that, where she was talking about sloth. And acedia is a sin which believes in nothing, cares for nothing, enjoys nothing, loves nothing, hates nothing, finds purpose in nothing for which it will die. So I think she described why we can never have perpetual machines.
Yeah, that's a great connection. The lack of communication, the lack of communing that is represented by a perpetual machine it's a very despairing picture, isn't it? Because if you
enjoy nothing, you can't take love.
Yeah.
We heard her say you give no love. So you're not giving love, but you can't take it. You enjoy nothing. So that, to me, labels a person as a perpetual machine through their engagement with the world.
Right. And again, I don't think that's a real person, right? Because literally person means to be sounded through. That means you are being engaged and engaging. And that's so with Moses and the idea of calling, we've talked about it as this relational piece. There's another involved and you're relating to the other. And in this case, it's the highest other, it's God. And it's a wonderful relationship. It's wonderful. It's full of wonder. And therefore it's inspiring and it's got higher purpose that doesn't fail, but it's interactive is what I want to get to here. Is that sometimes the way that God is described is as the Word. Well, Jesus is the Word, like he's the Logos in the Greek. And that means that he's the communication of God to us in a way that we can understand. He becomes flesh, comes among us, dwells with us, and speaks to us and shows us what God is like in our humanity, in our hummus, like in down-to-earth ways. But he's speaking is the point. He's communicating. And that's what is happening for Moses here. This is a God who communicates. He shares what's on his mind and in his heart with Moses in a way that Moses understands it and can respond, and then ask a question of God. And so what we have there is a dialogue. And I think so much about calling, you see the way that Moses begins, he continues. He begins in a worshipful conversation with God. He every day continues in that. That's what he's described when he's leading Israel. He goes into the tent of meeting because this is a meeting place. He goes every day to meet with God and to talk to God. And he continues that conversation and he brings others into that conversation and expands that dialogue so that God, the Word, is heard. And I think a real calling is that dynamic. It begins that way. It continues that way with encountering God again and again and speaking with him again and again, which is such a gift. And it's so glorious. And it ends that way, inviting others into it, into that same wonder of having a conversation and therefore becoming a person with a purpose, which is higher than you and so wonderful that you can't help but share it.
So what are we thinking here? So we've talked through the original calling, being called. We went through the assignment. We went through the personal struggle that may be existing of not believing that you're supposed to be resonating to the tune that you're hearing. We continued on through to engaging about the distortions about purpose and vocation. So we talked about the fallacy of the perpetual machine. I am a rock. I am an island. So we talked about that. So I'd like to close us on, something positive direction for someone listening to this, and then they got to go back to their life, work life, life's work tomorrow.
Yeah.
How do they connect the burning bush story when they're like, we're not telling them to actually physically look for burning bushes, but if you do, give me a call or
Right.
take some video for me.
Well,
So
yeah, man, that'd be good. So I think the burning bush for us, we could think of it a little bit like the concept of the shimmering light, like those moments in your life where there was a spark of an inspiration and it really meant something to you. And those are probably moments where God was speaking something to you and a quickening of a desire or a longing. And it could be there for a long time. Usually those things we come back to again and again. And if you're a Christian too, you have the Holy Spirit, who's often described as a fire that descends upon you and inspires you and reveals God. Like he helps you remember things about who God really is. He's the one who causes the disciples to remember all the words that Jesus said. So it's that fire of revelation that spoke to you. And I mean to you very specifically, because Moses is addressed very personally here in who he is. Like all of his history matters. He's the son of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's how God says, I'm your God. And he's also addressing him to go and address the problem that Moses has had on his heart for a long time. And it was his unfinished business, as you put it on Saturday. So it's very personal. It's not irrelevant. And it's related to his gifts and his experiences too, because he lived in the palace and yet he knew the problem of the people. So he knows how to make his way around the palace. He's perfectly experienced and he has the expertise that has been honed over time and now humbled. And now he can go as God's representative. Also, though, it also says that, hey, I want you to gather the elders of Israel. Why does he do that? Because it's not just about Moses, and Moses is not going to just impose it on them anymore. So all of our callings, it's who we really are. And I don't know what that is for everybody. I've alluded to what it was for me and the moments in my life where that was fired up. But then it's from God. And then ultimately, I think your community and the people who are the elders and the mentors of, say, your art community that help you figure out how does it fit in and how do we make this real here in a living community,
I would like to add, engaging people in these conversations, whether it's deliberate or just random. When you listen to these stories and you go through the stories throughout the Bible, callings didn't come with paychecks. Very often I engage people who are depressed or feeling out of sync or out of place because they work somewhere, and where they work, where they collect their check, it's not their calling. I would argue that even the people in these stories we're talking about, they still needed to eat too. They still had families. They still had these very human concerns. And we even see where they asked about these concerns and they would be told, in so many words, don't worry about it. The birds don't worry if there's going to be worms when they wake up tomorrow. They don't sit around worrying about such things. Don't worry about it. So I would maybe just put that little nugget into people's heads that there's not an actual problem when you notice that your calling and your check are not the same thing. And in fact, I think it's probably very normal, actually. And I think maybe that's an unrealistic want from our culture today, that your paycheck and your paycheck comes to you from your calling.
Yeah, you're reminding me of well, Paul is the famous case, right? So the Apostle Paul, who many historians think is like the one person who's had the biggest impact on history in at least Western history by and large. So Paul, he's this prophet, preacher, apostle guy who really starts Christianity in a sense. He takes what's just a small band of disciples and brings it to the rest of the world, all 70 Gentile nations. And he had to make tents for a living. And maybe it was tents, but some people say it was actually a prayer tent, and he's trying to invite the nations into the house of prayer, which is what Israel had failed to do. So maybe it's not completely irrelevant, but it feels like it. It's like every day he's making tents, like the little prayer shawls, and yet his real calling is to spread the gospel, and he's a master, evangelist in doing that. But it seems like it's disconnected at times. And the last thing you're making me think of is something that apparently Justin Martyr, who was a very, very early theologian, writer in the church, wrote about. He lived in the Galilee area, and he could point to yokes that were still being used on oxen that had been built by Joseph and Jesus. And that obviously that's really interesting, because there's a lot of things that we do during the day so that we can eat and have a roof over our head. Doesn't mean that that's what we're reduced to, which is, I think, the problem with identifying too strongly your vocation with your occupation. I think most of us, those two things they're not unrelated totally, but they're not equal. They're not reducible to occupation typically.
So yeah, maybe that'd be the last feel-good thing that I'd want to say to everybody. Then, don't listen to the world if the world's telling you that your calling should come with a paycheck. I would argue that most callings don't actually. But the task, and to the point, is you still need to eat. So, figuring out how to engage your calling while getting a paycheck. Maybe that is that is a better framing of question of how to proceed through your life and how to proceed forward. Not trying to figure out how to get paid to, preach the good word at the golf courses in Florida, because you feel that's your calling to preach the good word on the golf courses. And it might be. I had a chaplain in the Army. That's what he said. He's like, I just feel this calling that I'm supposed to save souls on the golf courses in Florida. So
maybe you never know.
Having said that, though, he was working towards retirement, so he could get that retirement check. But yeah, I think that would be the thing where I feel like people make it harder than it needs to be on them, and I think that's one of the unreasonable things. Don't expect your calling to come with a paycheck.
Yeah, right on. That's good, man. Thank you. It's great talking to you.
You as well, sir. I look forward to our next session. Everyone, just so you know, this month we'll be continuing on with work and calling. And we said we were going to just do 2 of these, but I'm almost wondering if we should just do a separate one on Sabbath. I'm wondering if we should just do one. So we have the 3. We have work, we have calling. So I think we might have made a decision just now, but I think we're gonna work that out and do a 3rd one before this month ends on Sabbath.
All right, man. God bless.
Thanks everybody for listening.